Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another history episode, to a new series. So, I was always fascinated about the history of France, and in the last two series, we've seen something related to Napoleon Bonaparte. But I decided to go backward to see even before Napoleon. And yes, I'm talking about the French Revolution. This has been a topic that has always interested me. But specifically, what are we going to see? We're going to see the causes of the French Revolution. It was a series of different events that shaped and triggered the revolution. I'm referring to the financial causes to this extent, and we're going to see how everything is going to evolve. So we're still going to have 8 episodes. Stick around until the end, and you're going to find out many little details that are, for the most part, unknown, at least to the things that people teach in schools. We're going to go a little bit deeper. The financial causes of the French Revolution have always intrigued me, and I've used this opportunity to try to understand them better. I'm not entirely sure I figured it out, but there are a few things that I'm certain of. When you look at why the revolution broke out, it's clear that there are many reasons. There are entire books on the subject titled The Causes of the French Revolution that discuss how people hated the privileges of the nobility and the clergy, but that's just part of the story. At the same time, there are a growing wealthy bourgeoisie of business owners, industrialists who were emerging and had no political power. They wanted more influence in the country's decision. And then there is the misery of the poor, bad harvest, rising grain prices, and with it the cost of bread, which shot up. It was unthinkable for people to survive, and this led to hunger, discontent, and popular uprisings. All of these factors together contributed to the French Revolution. But in this series, we're going to focus on something else. We'll be exploring the massive budget deficits of the French monarchy, built up over a century of reckless spending and outrageous taxation. This financial disaster ultimately forced the king to take a dramatic step, the one we all know as the beginning of the French Revolution. There is the convocation of the Estates General. What did it really mean, the convocation of the Estates General, and why was it so critical? Well, what's clear is that when King Louis XVI called the Estates General, he had no idea, just 4 years later, the consequence would be, let's say, a headache for him, a migraine, more specifically the loss of his own head. But he did not know that yet. And that, of course, was all due to the catastrophic state of the monarchy's finances. We'll see how, faced with the disaster of a broken budget, the French monarchy repeatedly turned to economists who claimed to have the answers, economists who knew exactly what needed to be done to fix the situation. We'll see how the idea that an economy can be managed and even revived based on theories of economists is not exactly a recent development. The 18th century in France is full of examples of such attempts. Now, let's set the scene. We're in France in the 1700s under an absolute monarchy. What does that mean? It means the king has absolute power and he can do whatever he wants without needing approval from anyone. There's no formal process requiring him to ask for anyone's permission. He can issue orders without any justification, simply by the king's will. One of the tools the king has at his disposal was the lettre de cachet. This was an official document that bearing the royal seal, granting the king absolute authority. With this authority, the king could have had anyone arrested without explanation and thrown into the Bastille, in jail, in the prison, the Bastille, for as long as he wished, even for life. These letters allowed the king to issue direct and often arbitrary orders without the need for a trial or legal justification. In addition to this, the king could make any law he wanted without needing approval from any parliament or ministry. And of course, he could impose taxes however and whenever he saw fit. Now, in the Middle Ages, it wasn't exactly like this. Monarchies weren't always this way. For centuries, king had powers, but those powers were balanced by the influence of the greater nobility. But things started to change with Louis XIV in France, the Sun King. From his reign onward, France experienced what we know an absolute monarchy. You probably heard the famous phrase, "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. This is what the king said back then. What did it really mean? Well, sure, there were advisors, secretaries, and ministries, but they were all under the king's control. Now, if we look at the French monarchy in the early 1700s, still under the shadow of Louis XIV, we get a fascinating perspective from the memoirs of one of the great nobles of the time, the Duke of Saint-Simon. Saint-Simon lived through Louis XIV's entire reign, from his mature years to his old age, and he lived long enough to write his memoirs. Published in the mid-1700s, these memoirs are a massive work, 7 or 8 volumes, each with 1,000 pages long, packed with gossip, anecdotes, and reflections. And through them, we get a glimpse of what it really was to live under the absolute monarchy of the Sun King, Louis XIV. Saint-Simon represents a faction in the kingdom that was deeply unhappy with the concept of absolute monarchy. Now, if we think about the French Revolution nearly a century later, the ones leading the change against the monarchy were the bourgeoisie, the intellectuals, and the Enlightenment thinkers. But at the start of the 1700s, the ones protesting were different. They were the great nobles, princes, dukes. Figures like Saint-Simon, who had grown accustomed to wielding significant power in the kingdom. The idea that the king now held absolute authority was especially offensive to them. It was, a political power play. Everybody wanted to have power over the other. However, the king always sat at the top. Saint-Simon gives us a bleak account of the final years of Louis XIV's reign. This was a time when France was locked in a disastrous war against almost the entire world, the War of the Spanish Succession. The War of the Spanish Succession went on started in 1701 until 1714, and was fought over who should succeed the childless Spanish King Charles II, who named Philip of Anjou, the grandson of French King Louis XIV, as his heir. European powers, particularly England and Austria, feared that a union between France and Spain under the same family would disrupt the balance of power. The war saw France and Spain fighting against a coalition of England, Austria, and the Dutch Republic, and others. The conflict ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which allowed Philip V to remain as King of Spain, but renounce any claim to the French throne. The treaty also led to territorial changes, with Britain gaining Gibraltar, Austria acquiring parts of Italy, and the Spanish territories. The war reshaped Europe's political landscape, reducing France's dominance and establishing a new balance of power. For France, this war was a catastrophe, and what's fascinating is that our chronicler, Saint-Simon, writing many years later, looks back and declares that war was going badly from the catastrophe of Turin onward. Now, what is the catastrophe of Turin? It's the siege of Turin in 1706 that was involved in the War of Spanish Succession. The siege of Turin in 1706 was a pivotal moment in the war because in May, a French army of 44,000 led by Louis d'Aubusson de la Feuillade attempted to capture Turin, a crucial city in northern Italy, Torino. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the defenders, led by Victor Amadeus II and later Eugene of Savoy, held strong. After months of resistance, Eugene launched a surprise attack with 30,000 allied troops, while the city's defenders staged a coordinated assault. The French were overwhelmed and forced to retreat, securing northern Italy for the Grand Alliance. This victory ended French ambitions in the region, solidified Eugene's reputation as a military genius, and marked the rise of Victor Amadeus II, who would later become the first king of Sardinia. Decades later, Saint-Simon reflects on the events, writing, "The ruin of France began with the catastrophe at Turin, when we were driven out of Italy. From that moment on, and that from that moment on, France was no longer mattered in Italy, and that was the beginning of our downfall." Now, fast forward to 1710, 4 years after that disaster, France is in a terrible state. The country has just endured the harshest winter of the century, and misery is everywhere. The treasury is empty. There isn't a single coin to spare. The budget deficit is staggering. The king is buried in debt, and the ripple effects are devastating. The king isn't paying his debts, and he isn't paying salaries. Even the army fighting at the front lines is going unpaid. And to be fair, it's not that the king isn't paying anything at all, he just isn't paying in currency. And here's an important detail to keep in mind. This was a time before paper money. Banknotes, which we think is an outdated relic today, even if still in circulation, hadn't even been invented yet. Until very recently, paper money was considered a modern innovation. Now, of course, modern times, we move beyond that into the era of electronic money, but back then the concept of paper money didn't even exist. In the early 18th century France, there was no such thing as paper money, not yet. Coins were made of metal, ideally precious metal. The currency that really mattered was, of course, gold and silver coins, circulating because everyone trusted their intrinsic value, something no one could take away. Of course, smaller coins were also in use. After all, you couldn't go to the market, buy 6 eggs, and hand over a silver écu worth, like, for example, $50. So smaller denominations were accepted, more out of convention than anything else. But when it came to serious transactions, gold and silver were the standards. By 1710, however, gold and silver coins had all but disappeared from circulation in France. Those who had them weren't letting them go. The king, on the other hand, was paying with promises, essentially IOUs. These were promissory notes printed at the royal mint, known as billets de la monnaie. Each one carried the message saying, "The mint of His Majesty promises to pay to the bearer of this note the sum of," an example, 1,000 francs in this year. Now, we're still too early for the franc. That will come much, much later. But promises, as we know, can only go so far. The king issues these notes, and because they come directly from him, people are obliged to accept them. However, once they are in circulation, they quickly lose their appeal. Few believe that in a year's time, they will be able to take these notes to the royal mint and exchange them for gold coins as promised. As a result, people rush to offload them. Picture this. I hold a billet de la monnaie, valued at, example again, 1,000 francs. But I am desperate. I am hungry. I need to buy food. And you offer me 100 francs in gold. I would gladly take the gold. Why? Because gold is tangible wealth and it's immediate, and it seems unlikely that this paper note will retain its value. Those with real wealth, gold and silver, hold the paper notes by keeping them hidden from circulation. Meanwhile, the notes continue to change hands, losing value with each transaction. You might wonder, but who profits from this situation? Well, the bankers. They seize the opportunity to gather these promissory notes at a fraction of their face value, speculate on currency exchanges, and leverage their government connection to enrich themselves, while the rest of the population sinks deeper into hardship. The bankers emerge as the only winners. Well, this is the first part, the first episode of our series, and serious, then stick around to find out in the next episode what's going to happen, because there will be many turns, curious turns and turns of events with economists that will proclaim to have the answers to the sickness of the economy, and to have different solution, and to restore wealth and well-being in the populace. But we'll see how different things will evolve. Thank you very much for following up so far, and I will see you next time. Bye.